This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. This is our podcast episode 100. We've made it to the triple digits. Woohoo! Yeah, and if you're listening to the podcast and not watching on YouTube, you missed the happy dances going on.
Missed all the fun.
Right? Totally.
Yes, so, goodness, here we go. I'm just going to start with an ask. In honor of our 100th episode, sort of a birthday, if you will, would you go rate us, review us, like us, share us, subscribe to us, and all that good social media stuff? We would appreciate the love. And Kathryn just gave you a big thumbs up and a smile.
We're getting out in the world. We're coming of age.
Coming of age, that's right. Yes, so today...
Now that we're 100.
Yeah, yes, yep. And we aren't even counting the early days of video-only episodes. These are 100 since we went to podcast. So we're talking about flashbacks today, how to effectively use them, and maybe we'll trigger a flashback or two to past episodes as we talk here. All right. So, Kathryn, you were just telling me that you have been working on a project in which you feel like you really effectively used flashbacks, maybe for the first time as a writer. So I'm going to open by giving you the talking stick. Yeah.
Right. In the head with the talking stick. I've been writing this short story, and shameless plug for Alida's courses. I started it in the middle of Alida's character course. Character art course, right?
Character development.
Yeah. And I loved it, and I was really into it, and we did this whole thing on flashbacks, and I was like, I've never done that before. So I finally finished draft number 2 with all the flashbacks in place, and I feel like I actually make a character arc theme point with my flashbacks in order to enrich and really strengthen my story, and it makes me so happy.
Awesome.
Sorry, you guys get all the happy dances on video here.
Yeah, they are good things. They are good things. Some of our podcast listeners might be going to YouTube just to check out our visual antics.
Mostly just me. I'm the only goofball. I'm just kidding.
I wouldn't say that. Yeah, okay, so you said something really important there, is that the flashbacks are critical to the character's arc. Yes. So, truism there for all of us fiction writers: if you introduce a flashback, the point is not just to fill the reader in on something that happened in the past. It is to advance your story and show us that thing that is relevant to the now story and the now character. So do you have an example, if you don't mind sharing, of how one of your flashbacks is affecting the character arc specifically?
Sure. So the action of the story takes place very much isolated. The character is alone. So in the first flashback, we get to see him as a child in a very I guess I would say vulnerable position. Something happens to him. The loss of his father happens. And you get to see kind of who he is and how he became who he is in that first little scene, that then kind of gives you a reason for why he is now isolated in the place that he is. I don't want to get too detail-oriented, but basically you get the chance to get to know who he was and why that affects where he is right now. And then we progress through that.
Okay. So
Does that make sense?
I think so. So it's the issue of the event that made the character who he is today, basically.
Yes. Yeah. And since I have him in a situation where he's alone, right? I need to bring back some sort of situation where he's interacting with others in order to show that effectively, because otherwise he's just sitting there talking to himself, and that becomes very boring very quickly. Whereas in a moment of basically in the moment that he transitions from ordinary world to extraordinary world, he gets that flashback where you get to see why who he is happened through the loss of his dad. So
nice. Yeah. How do you like to use flashbacks, Robert, or do you not like to use flashbacks? Oh, we lost your audio.
Microphone.
I had muted myself because I was drinking, sorry.
Okay. Water, right. Specify.
It's been an unseasonably hot autumn, actually. So for those who know the new money, it's been 32 degrees more or less every day, which is hot. So I know to Americans they're going to listen 32 degrees.
That's freezing. Cold, water is freezing.
Exactly. So go look up 32 Celsius because I can't be bothered to do the conversion for you right now. Anyway. That's an aside. That's the flashback.
Right. Well,
to my mic. It's not that I don't like to use them. I think I fell into the trap of the early writer advice of never use flashbacks because, and it's not a bad thing really, because if you constrained within that rule, it probably makes you essentially write a better story. I think it's flashbacks come about when, as Kathryn saying, you thoughtfully consider, how can I have my story have more impact? And it isn't necessarily. The trap is obviously, as you said, dumping exposition. I really need to know this. So the golden rule with flashbacks is always, only just enough, the minimum amount you need to make the story work, and at the right time. So I've resisted, but I can see. I listened to a really good Story Grid Editors Roundtable podcast, and they analyze movies every week, and they use a movie because it's just more time efficient. But they're writers and they apply it to writing. And one of the ladies there, Anne Hawley, is specifically looking at unusual story structure. So it might be complex story or nested story or stories that loop or flashbacks. So they did an episode, and I can't even remember what the movie was, but they've done a couple where she specifically looked at do the flashbacks work. And so she's gone back and extracted the flashbacks out of the movie completely and looked at them as their own separate arc, which is probably what you've advised in your character lessons, is to if you're going to have a flashback, it should also probably have some movement of itself in general. But the one thing that really stuck with me was, can a flashback add emotional stakes to a crisis that a character is facing? So if it provides an insight that you didn't previously have, then I think that's a wonderful moment where, and it could just be a thought in the character's head, am I going to make that same mistake again? Last time I did this, it turned into a tragedy. So, if it causes decision making for the character in their current story, I really like the idea of flashbacks for that. So I'm not keen on them as just revelation. But yeah, for sure. It's not that I don't like them. As a reader, I really don't like them. But I think that's because so many times, sadly, they're just too heavy-handed or too big.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's easy for writers to fall into the trap of relying on flashbacks to show the reader some piece of the past that could be better delivered in another way. There are 3 ways I talk about in my character book and in the course Kathryn mentioned. One is using narrative exposition. That's the most efficient way. You simply, in your narrative voice, explain something to the reader. It might take a sentence, it might take a paragraph, it might take a page or 2, whatever, but you just get us there, show us what we need to see in narrative. The second way,
like the last time John drove a car, it didn't end well.
Yeah.
That's a flashback, really, isn't it?
Well, it's narrative exposition.
Yeah.
And
backstory for your...
Right, it's backstory being revealed through narrative. And the...
Recall, it would have been a flashback.
The second way is using dialogue, when characters are talking to each other about the past, and then through that conversation and the subtext, the reader picks up on what happened. So, as with anything in fiction, you don't want to be heavy-handed and have a character explain to the reader what happened, because these characters already know what happened. So they aren't telling each other what happened, they're talking about it. And the third way is to go flashback, which is when you trigger the movement from the now story, and you take the reader into the past and you write that past as a full-blown scene. So we go back in time to live that experience with the character. And that's what distinguishes a flashback from dialogue or exposition when it comes to revealing the past. So flashback takes the most ink, takes the most time to read, gets the most ink on the page, because you're doing the scene building just like you do for the now story. You're giving us sensory details. You're giving us emotional power. We're living it. So which one is best depends on what you're doing in the now story and what's going to prevent loss of momentum, prevent bogging down the story, which way is the best reveal,
Yeah, for me, for the short story that I was writing, it's a lot about emotional impact, because I really want it to hit you in the gut. And that when I tried a little bit of narrative exposition or a little bit with him talking to somebody else, it lost a lot of the visceral impact that I wanted it to have. Whereas if I give you those kind of snippet snapshots of his past in between his actual active journey, it hits you really hard, viscerally, so emotionally it changes the pace and the structure of the story, which is another reason to choose a flashback over something that could be a little bit more less impact, like an exposition moment.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it takes great skill to do that as well, to not jar the reader. And to make it hard for the reader to continually be switching time states in their mind. But there's been some pretty famous literary examples where you've got lots of different time frames or parallel stories or that involve flashbacks. So I guess it does come down to how deft you can be with your storytelling. There's no reason to ban it completely. I think you made a good point, Alida, is that often newer writers want to use it to do more telling. And so, we come back to that show, don't tell, but in a more broad sense. What is this showing about the story? And as we were talking, I recalled, I don't know if you've seen the movie Arrival, but it's based on a short story by Ted Chiang called The Story of Your Life. And that's worth reading. It's a fascinating story because there's kind of flashback and flash forward, because the whole point of the movie is that the aliens come to teach a particular skill, which then enables us to step outside of our own perception of time. And the short story is written in a way to force the reader to try to think that way. So even the mechanics of the story are trying to twist your head around what do we really perceive in terms of time. So that's a clever way of using flashbacks and flash forwards as a way of disturbing the reader in a way.
Right, it does. And it's a very conceptual short story because, as you say, it's making us think about time and chronology differently, whereas in a normal story, you're going to use flashback for the purpose of revealing something from the character's backstory. And it's flashback is a wonderful, powerful tool that should not be dismissed. I'm not sure why it got the bad rap it did, maybe because people were overusing it to poor effect, but it's knowing which one is best for the movement you're in your now story? Is it narrative, short and sweet, keep the momentum going? So the example I put into the character book that I wrote, a man is going home for his father's funeral, and he hasn't been home since his father kicked him out of the house. So the whole scenario triggers his flashback. He's driving home after being away for, 15, 20 years. And he remembers the night his father kicked him out. So we go back, we relive it, full emotional impact, right? In the dialogue example, he's home for the funeral, and he and his mother start talking about his father, and we learn that she didn't really know the truth of what happened that night, right? And she's got friends in the kitchen washing up the dishes after the, kind of memorial at the house thing after the funeral. So they might be overhearing things that are a revelation to the friends. So in the flashback, I want the reader to feel how traumatic this was for my protagonist. So if that's my goal, use the flashback. In the dialogue one, the reveal isn't so much about that night he was kicked out. It's about his mother, his relationship to his mother, her relationship to the community, and the ripple effects this knowledge is going to have in her life. So see how your choice depends not only on what you're revealing, the momentum you have, the emotional impact you want to create, but also your goal for that movement. Right?
Yeah, 100%. I think the flashback relates more to your character arc and your theme, and less to your interrelationships between your characters and your plot. So,
right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. The dialogue example definitely would go into subplot and supporting character relationships with the protagonist and his mother, and then even rippling out into the community. Yeah.
It's tough because you as a writer, you probably attached your reader very strongly, hopefully anyway, to your character's current time, your present time. So that first instance of flashback at least has got to grab the reader, by the throat and drag them into it, because you are going to jar them away from current flow state, and that might not be a bad thing, because that might be what you're wanting to do as an author. But that's why I think it's a real skill, and probably why lots of new writers have been warned off, because it's not something you do lightly. You do it purposely, as opposed to, as you say, just for revelation. So I like the fact that you brought it into giving us more emotional depth. I think that's probably almost always the reason why you want to do it, is to show a character's wound as opposed to show what happened in the past. If all you want to do is show what happened in the past, then make that the story.
Right. Well, this is...
okay, so what? But why? Why is that important to the character I'm reading about now?
Right. And one might make the case that just showing what happened in the past is sometimes enough. Often not, but I've just been watching Tin Star on Amazon. Have either of you seen any of that?
No.
So this sheriff in the Canadian Rockies, somebody from his past comes and tries to kill him, and his whole family is in danger, and all kinds of trouble happens. It's, I think, a 10-episode season. So about episode 8, right before the climax, we have an entire episode of flashback where we go back in time 10 years and we see who this sheriff was 10 years ago and what effect he had on the people who have now turned up to try to kill him. And as you were talking, Robert, I was thinking, oh, that's really all they did, because it didn't advance the plot, right? It really just took us back in time to answer these questions of, who was he then? What did he do back then? What happened to the people who now have this vendetta against him. And, you know, I was completely engaged by it. I was interested in it. So maybe, maybe if it's done well enough, with enough build up so that the reader is dying to have those questions answered, then maybe just showing us what happened back then is enough.
Yeah, I have another example of that, a fiction one. It's a book called Crooked Kingdom by Leigh Bardugo. And it's the sequel of the first book's called Six of Crows. And you spend the entire first book not understanding this main character's past, and he doesn't give you any clues, ever. And it drives you crazy. And in the second book, they literally just bring in the flashback so that you understand more about what he's doing, but none of the other characters get to learn it. He doesn't reveal it, but as a reader, it gives you a greater understanding and empathy for the character who is turning kind of unlikable because of the things that have happened to him in the past. So you get that revelation, which kind of draws you deeper in, and you really buy in to him as a character, and you want to see him fixed. Now you know what needs to be fixed. So it doesn't necessarily move specific plot forward, but it gives you a greater relationship with the character.
Yeah, interesting. So a greater relationship with the character, answering questions you know readers are begging to have answered. Relevance to the now story is key, even if you're just addressing those first two goals, and you know, accomplishing the goal of this movement within your story, advancing your story. Did I miss any of our high points?
I would making the dilemmas and crises more high stakes, because now you know why that decision is going to cost them.
Right. Yeah, so, that's a really good point. Yeah, interesting. Yes. I was just thinking, I could say more about Tin Star. And actually, I think I will, because I think it would be valuable. Hopefully it is. As you said that, Robert, I just realized they did do a little more than just show us the past and answer those questions. There was a plot point that hinged on this. So when that flashback episode opened, one of the killers is talking to the sheriff's daughter. So we've really even left the protagonist's point of view, you know, but it's TV, it's not narrative fiction. And how the daughter views her father, the sheriff, after getting this story. That's the piece of it that advances the plot. So it does both of those things, of answering all of the audience questions, and then it also, the next plot point hinges on the daughter's knowledge of the past. Yeah. Anything else either of you would like to say about flashbacks?
I guess it's something you can experiment with pretty easily, and you know, I mean, it's interesting that one of the things you can do is take them all out. So if you have them separated, take them all out, and if it doesn't change the story, they probably didn't need to be there. Right. So that's one experiment that you can do, because they may not. I mean, I know I said that they should represent their own little mini arc, and to some degree, that's not a bad way to think about it, but they don't have to. Of course, it's just might be there to drip feed a specific emotional point. Right. But does the story still work if you take them out completely? If it does, you probably don't need them.
Yeah, and when you're thinking about using a flashback, as you said, Robert, experiment. So write the delivery of that information, write that reveal as narrative exposition. Reveal it in dialogue. Then write it as a flashback, and then you can compare them.
And then that's you can see which way works best.
Yeah, that's only going to be a few pages worth of writing total, so do it. Do the comparison work.
Absolutely.
Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.